The golden glow of candlelight bathed the elegant dining room, reflecting off crystal glasses and polished silverware. Marcelino sat at a prime corner table, the city skyline stretching behind him through floor-to-ceiling windows. Gabriella, dressed in an immaculate black evening gown, was laughing at something he had said, her hand lightly resting on his arm. To anyone watching, they were the perfect couple. Powerful, poised, and magnetic. But Marcelino's mind was far from the conversation at the table. As Gabriella recounted her latest business triumphs, his gaze drifted toward the back of the restaurant. Amid the bustling servers and the hum of quiet chatter, a figure caught his eye, a woman moving between tables with practiced efficiency. She wore a simple uniform, her hair pulled into a tight bun, and despite her evident fatigue, she carried herself with quiet dignity. Marcelino froze, his fork halting mid-air. It was her, Caitlin, his ex-wife. The woman he hadn't seen in nearly a year stood just a few feet away, balancing a tray of drinks. She moved with a grace that belied the exhaustion etched into her face. Marcelino's eyes trailed lower, and his breath caught. Beneath her apron, the unmistakable curve of a pregnant belly made his chest tighten. "What's wrong?" Gabriella's voice cut through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. Her sharp gaze followed his line of sight, but Marcelino quickly shook his head and forced a smile. "Nothing," he replied, though his voice wavered. "Just someone I thought I recognized." Gabriella's brows furrowed, but she let it slide, turning her attention back to her wine glass. Marcelino's hands clenched beneath the table. Questions swirled in his mind. How long had Caitlin been here? Who was the father of her child? Why was she working a job like this? He thought back to their divorce, the bitterness that had marked their final days together, and the words he had chosen to ignore. As Caitlin approached a nearby table, Marcelino's heart raced. She hadn't noticed him yet. He wasn't sure whether that was a blessing or a curse. Her movements were mechanical but precise, and though her face was tired, there was a quiet determination in her expression. She was so different from the woman he remembered, yet still so familiar. Caitlin? He hadn't meant to say it aloud, but the name slipped out, barely above a whisper. Her head snapped in his direction. Their eyes locked for the briefest moment, and her expression flickered between shock, pain, and something else, something harder. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the kitchen. Marcelino sat back, the weight of her silence pressing down on him. He felt Gabriella's eyes on him again, sharp and questioning, but he couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze. "I need a moment," he muttered, rising abruptly from his seat. Marcelino weaved through the maze of tables, his polished leather shoes tapping softly against the restaurant's tiled floor. The warmth of the dining area gave way to the cooler utilitarian ambience of the kitchen as he pushed through the swinging doors. The buzz of activity, the clinking of dishes, the sizzle of pans was almost deafening, but Marcelino's focus remained fixed on one person. Caitlin stood at a counter, her back turned to him, methodically wiping down a tray. For a moment he hesitated, watching her from a distance. She seemed smaller than he remembered, her shoulders slightly hunched as if carrying a burden heavier than any he could imagine. Yet there was resilience in the way she moved, a quiet strength that made his chest ache. "Caitlin," he said, louder this time. She stiffened at the sound of his voice. Slowly, she turned to face him, her eyes narrowing with a mix of disbelief and irritation. "Marcelino," she said, her voice flat and devoid of the warmth it once held. "What are you doing here?" He faltered, the words he'd rehearsed in his head evaporating under her steely gaze. "I didn't know you were working here." Her lips curled into a wry smile, though there was no humor in it. "What? You thought I'd be lounging on a beach somewhere after everything that happened?" Her tone was sharp, cutting through the polished armor Marcelino had built around himself. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Caitlin, I didn't mean—" "No," she interrupted, holding up a hand. "You don't get to mean anything anymore. Not after the way you left." Marcelino flinched. He had been prepared for anger, but the raw pain in her voice caught him off guard. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he hadn't known how to fix what they had broken. But every excuse felt hollow in the face of her quiet fury. "Is it?" He hesitated, his eyes flickering to her belly. "Is it mine?" Caitlin's expression hardened. "That's none of your business." "None of my—" Marcelino's voice rose, but he caught himself, glancing around at the kitchen staff, who were now watching the exchange with open curiosity. He lowered his voice again. "Caitlin, if it's mine, I have a right to know." She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "A right? You don't get to talk about rights, Marcelino, not after you walked away from everything." Before he could respond, one of the chefs called out her name, gesturing toward a stack of plates waiting to be delivered. Caitlin grabbed a tray, her movements abrupt and forceful, but she paused before stepping away. "Stay out of my life, Marcelino," she said, her voice low but firm. "I've built something for myself, something for this baby, and I won't let you ruin it." And with that, she disappeared back into the dining room, leaving Marcelino standing alone in the chaotic kitchen. He felt the stares of the staff, but ignored them, his mind racing. Her words echoed in his ears, each one a reminder of the mistakes he had tried so hard to forget. Marcelino eventually made his way back to the table, where Gabriella sat with her arms crossed and an impatient scowl on her face. "Are you going to tell me what that was about?" she demanded. "Or am I supposed to guess?" "It's nothing," Marcelino said quickly, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. Gabriella narrowed her eyes but said nothing more. Marcelino barely touched his food for the rest of the evening, his mind consumed by the image of Caitlin, her defiance, her strength, and the life growing inside her. As they left the restaurant, Gabriella slipped her arm through his, but he barely noticed. The night air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of city life. Marcelino glanced back at the restaurant one last time, his thoughts a tangled mess of guilt, curiosity, and something he couldn't quite name. For the first time in years, Marcelino felt a crack in the carefully constructed world he had built for himself, and he knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The city skyline glittered against the night as Marcelino stood at the window of his penthouse, a glass of untouched bourbon in his hand. The warmth and charm of the evening at the restaurant had long since faded, replaced by a hollow unease that gnawed at his chest. Caitlin's face, tired but resolute, was all he could see, and the sight of her rounded belly haunted him. He swirled the drink absently, his mind a whirlwind of unanswered questions. He turned away from the view and crossed the room to his sleek, minimalist desk. The space, like much of his life, was a reflection of control and precision. But tonight, it felt suffocating. Grabbing his phone, he dialed a familiar number. "Atticus," he said when the call connected. "I need your help." On the other end, Atticus Preston's voice carried its usual calm. "Marcelino? It's late. What's going on?" Marcelino hesitated, his words caught between guilt and urgency. "It's Caitlin. I saw her tonight." There was a pause before Atticus replied, his tone careful. "I didn't think you'd spoken to her since the divorce. What happened?" "She's pregnant," Marcelino said bluntly, the admission weighing heavily on him. "And she was working as a waitress. She looked tired, like she's been through hell." The line was silent for a moment before Atticus spoke again, this time with more gravity. "And what do you want me to do?" "Find out how she's doing," Marcelino said, pacing the length of the room. Where she's living, if she's with someone. I need to know what's going on. Atticus sighed. Marcelino, are you sure about this? Digging into Caitlin's life after everything that happened, it might not go the way you think. Marcelino stopped, his hand tightening around the glass. I don't care how it looks. I need to understand how she ended up like this. If the baby is mine. The words trailed off, leaving an unspoken weight between them. Atticus, ever pragmatic, knew better than to press further. I'll look into it, he said finally. But Marcelino, don't do this just to ease your guilt. If you're going to involve yourself in her life, make sure it's for the right reasons. Marcelino didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at the dark liquid in his glass, his reflection distorted in its surface. Just let me know what you find. He ended the call, setting the phone on the desk with a sharp exhale. The image of Caitlin, strong yet weary, lingered in his mind, a stark contrast to the woman she had once been. He knew that seeing her again had opened a door he couldn't ignore, no matter how much it unsettled him. Marcelino returned to the table, his face carefully composed, but Gabriella's piercing gaze met him before he could even sit. She leaned forward slightly, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the rim of her glass. Who is she? Gabriella's voice was calm, but the sharp edge underneath was unmistakable. Marcelino hesitated, his mind racing for an answer that wouldn't invite further questions. Just someone I used to know, he said finally, reaching for his wineglass in an attempt to appear unaffected. Gabriella tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. Someone you used to know, she repeated, her tone skeptical. She seemed more than that, judging by the way you looked at her. Marcelino placed the glass down, leaning back in his chair. It's not what you think, he said, though even to his own ears the words sounded hollow. Gabriella let out a soft laugh, devoid of humor. Of course it isn't, she said, her voice tinged with sarcasm. But you've been distant all evening, and now you're telling me it's nothing. She shook her head, setting her napkin down beside her plate. Marcelino, you're not a man who gets distracted easily, so forgive me if I don't believe you. For a moment, Marcelino considered telling her the truth, that the woman she'd seen was his ex-wife, that she was pregnant, and that seeing her had thrown him into turmoil. But Gabriella's probing gaze and the tension between them stopped him. He wasn't ready to explain, not when he didn't even have the answers himself. Let's not ruin the evening, he said instead, offering a placating smile. Can we talk about this later? Gabriella's expression didn't soften, but she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Later, she repeated. Fine, but don't think this conversation is over. The rest of the dinner passed in strained silence, with Gabriella occasionally glancing at him as if waiting for him to slip. Marcelino, however, was too preoccupied to notice. His mind was a whirlwind of memories and questions, all centered around Caitlin. After dinner, Marcelino and Gabriella exited the restaurant, the cool night air offering little relief to the tension between them. As their car pulled up to the curb, Marcelino paused, his hand on the door. I'll call you tomorrow, he said, his tone distant. Gabriella raised an eyebrow but didn't argue, sliding into the car without another word. As it drove off, Marcelino stood on the sidewalk, staring back at the restaurant. His chest tightened at the thought of Caitlin still inside, likely scrubbing tables or finishing her shift. Unable to resist, Marcelino walked back to the entrance. The maitre d', a tall man with a polished demeanor, raised an eyebrow in surprise. Mr. Blake, was everything not to your satisfaction? He asked, his tone careful. Marcelino shook his head. The food was fine. I just forgot something. Without waiting for a response, he made his way inside, scanning the dining area. The once busy room was quieter now, with most of the patrons gone and a few servers clearing tables. Caitlin wasn't in sight, but Marcelino's steps carried him toward the back, where a small hallway led to the kitchen. He stopped short when he saw her, leaning against the counter and wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. The soft light of the kitchen illuminated her face, and for a moment she looked as though the weight of the world was pressing down on her shoulders. Marcelino opened his mouth to call her name, but hesitated, unsure of what he would even say. As if sensing his presence, Caitlin turned, her eyes narrowing as they met his. She straightened, her posture defensive. "What are you doing back here?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Marcelino hesitated, suddenly aware of how intrusive he must seem. "I just wanted to—" "To what?" Caitlin interrupted, crossing her arms. "Say hi? Offer me a drink? Or maybe you're here to remind me how great your life is." Her words stung, but Marcelino didn't flinch. "Caitlin," he said softly, "I didn't know you were here. I didn't know that I was pregnant." She finished for him, her tone sharp. "Why would you? You walked away from everything, Marcelino. You made it clear that you didn't care." "I made mistakes," Marcelino admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "But seeing you tonight—" "Don't!" Caitlin cut him off, her voice trembling now. "Don't pretend like you care all of a sudden. Whatever guilt you're feeling, it's too late. I've moved on." Her words were final, her expression cold. Marcelino took a step back, the weight of her rejection settling in his chest. For the first time in years, he was at a loss for words. Caitlin turned away, picking up a tray and disappearing into the kitchen. Marcelino stood there for a long moment before finally leaving, his mind reeling. He knew Caitlin was right. He had no right to interfere in her life. But as he stepped into the cool night air, one thought consumed him. He couldn't walk away again. Marcelino stepped into the dimly lit restaurant, his heart pounding harder with each step. The familiar hum of conversation and clinking silverware filled the air, but he barely noticed. His focus was solely on Caitlin. The brief encounter a few nights ago had left him restless, questions swirling endlessly in his mind. Tonight, he was determined to speak to her, no matter how much resistance she might put up. As he scanned the room, he spotted her at a table near the back, balancing a tray as she cleared away empty glasses. She moved quickly, with the same quiet determination he had seen before. Her exhaustion was evident in the faint slump of her shoulders, but there was something unyielding about her posture, as if sheer willpower was keeping her upright. Marcelino hesitated for a moment, his resolve faltering. What was he expecting her to say? That she wanted his help? That she forgave him? The bitterness in her eyes last time had been enough to remind him that forgiveness would not come easily, if at all. Still, he pushed forward, weaving through the tables until he was standing just a few feet from her. "Caitlin," he said, his voice low, but firm enough to cut through the noise. She froze, the tray in her hands tilting slightly before she steadied it. Slowly, she turned to face him, her expression a mix of irritation and disbelief. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone clipped. "I need to talk to you," Marcelino said, keeping his voice steady despite the tension radiating between them. "Just 5 minutes, please." "I don't have 5 minutes," Caitlin replied curtly, setting the tray down on a nearby table. "I'm working." "Caitlin, no!" She cut him off, her eyes narrowing. "You don't get to just walk in here and demand my time. You made it clear a long time ago that I wasn't a priority." Her words hit harder than he had expected, but Marcelino held his ground. "I know I messed up," he said, his tone softening. "But I'm not here to talk about the past. I need to understand what's happening now." "What's happening now?" Caitlin echoed, crossing her arms. You think you can waltz back into my life and act like you care? You're too late, Marcelino. Her voice rose slightly, drawing a few curious glances from nearby tables. Noticing this, Caitlin took a step back, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. I'm not doing this with you, she said firmly, picking up the tray again. Go home. Marcelino felt the sting of her words, but refused to leave. Caitlin, please, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm not asking for much. Just tell me if the baby is mine. Her expression hardened, and for a moment he thought she might throw the tray at him. Instead, she set it down again, her hands trembling slightly. Why do you care? She asked, her voice quieter now but no less sharp. You didn't care about me when it mattered. Why should this baby be any different? Marcelino took a deep breath, steadying himself against the weight of her words. Caitlin's anger was justified, and he knew it. But the thought of walking away again, leaving things unresolved, was unbearable. Because it does matter, he said, his voice trembling slightly. Maybe I didn't show it before. Maybe I was too blind, too selfish to see what I was losing. But if there's a chance this baby is mine, I can't ignore it. I won't. Caitlin's lips pressed into a tight line, her jaw clenched. You don't get to swoop in now and play the hero, Marcelino. This isn't about you feeling better about yourself. I know it's not, Marcelino replied quickly. And I'm not trying to fix things for me. I'm trying… He hesitated, searching for the right words. I'm trying to take responsibility for the first time in my life. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to trust me. But I need to know if I have a chance to make things right. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Caitlin's eyes darted around the restaurant, clearly uncomfortable with the intensity of their exchange. Finally, she sighed, the fire in her gaze dimming just a little. This isn't the time or place for this, she said, her voice quieter now. I have a job to do, and I can't afford to lose it because of you. Marcelino nodded, though his chest ached with frustration. I understand, he said, but can we talk later? Anywhere you're comfortable. Just give me that. Caitlin looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity in his words. Her expression softened slightly, though the wariness remained. Fine, she said finally. Tomorrow, after my shift. There's a coffee shop down the street. Marcelino's shoulders sagged in relief. Thank you, he said earnestly. I'll be there. Without another word, Caitlin picked up her tray and turned away, disappearing into the back of the restaurant. Marcelino stood rooted to the spot, watching her go. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. A fragile, tentative hope that things might not be completely lost. As he left the restaurant, the cool night air hit him, bringing a moment of clarity. This wasn't just about the baby. It was about Caitlin, about the woman he had loved and failed, and the chance to prove to her that he could be better. Caitlin sat across from Daisy in the cramped break room of the restaurant, her arms folded protectively across her chest. The room smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and stale coffee, but Caitlin barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, still stuck on the encounter with Marcelino the night before. Daisy watched her carefully, concern etched into her face. You've been quiet all day, she said, setting down her mug. Is this about him, the guy from last night? Caitlin let out a heavy sigh, leaning back in her chair. It's not just about last night, she admitted. It's everything. Seeing him again brought back things I thought I'd buried. Daisy nodded, waiting for Caitlin to continue. It wasn't like her friend to open up easily, and Daisy knew better than to push too hard. Caitlin hesitated, then finally spoke, her voice quieter now. Do you remember when I told you I used to work in marketing? That I was at the top of my game?" Daisy nodded again, her expression encouraging. "You loved it," she said. "You always light up when you talk about it." Caitlin smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I did," she said. "I worked so hard to get there, and for a while I thought I had it all. Career success, a marriage that felt like a partnership, and a future that seemed bright. But Marcelino, he changed when his company started taking off. Suddenly, I wasn't his equal anymore. I was just his wife, the person who kept things running at home while he chased bigger dreams." Daisy frowned. "That doesn't sound like a partnership." "It wasn't," Caitlin said, her tone bitter. "I gave up everything for him. He said he needed me to be there, to support him, and I thought I was doing the right thing. But as the years went by, I realized he didn't see me as his partner anymore. He saw me as a convenience." Caitlin paused, the weight of her words pressing down on her. "And then there were the betrayals," she said softly. "I found out he was seeing other women, lying to me about business trips and making me feel disposable." Daisy's hands clenched into fists. "He cheated on you?" Caitlin nodded, her expression tight. "It wasn't just the affairs," she said. "It was the way he talked about me to them, like I was some burden he had to carry. He told them I didn't understand him, that I was holding him back." Daisy shook her head, anger flashing in her eyes. "That's disgusting." "It was," Caitlin agreed. "And when I confronted him, he didn't even try to deny it. He told me if I wasn't happy, I could leave. So I did." Daisy reached across the table, her hand gently covering Caitlin's. "You didn't deserve that," she said, her voice firm. "And you've been stronger than anyone I know for walking away." Caitlin gave her a weak smile. "It didn't feel strong at the time," she admitted. "I felt like I was losing everything, my home, my stability, my sense of who I was. But I couldn't stay, not after everything he did." "And now he's back," Daisy said, her tone laced with frustration. "Acting like he has the right to ask anything of you." Caitlin nodded, her jaw tightening. "Exactly. He didn't care enough to fight for us then, so why now? Why does he suddenly care if this baby is his?" Daisy hesitated before speaking. "Maybe he's trying to make up for what he did. People can change, Caitlin." Caitlin let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "Change? Marcelino? He's always been about control, about having everything his way. This isn't about him wanting to be a better person. It's about his guilt." Daisy leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. "Maybe," she said slowly. "But if he really wants to be involved, for the baby's sake, isn't it worth at least hearing him out? You don't have to forgive him, but it might give you some closure." Caitlin was silent for a long moment, her thoughts swirling. The idea of closure was tempting, but it felt out of reach. Still, she couldn't deny the small voice in her head that wondered if Marcelino's intentions were genuine. If nothing else, she needed to set boundaries, for herself and for the baby. Finally, she sighed. "I'm meeting him after my shift tonight," she said, her tone resigned. "I don't know what he expects to happen, but I'll give him his 5 minutes. After that, we'll see." Daisy squeezed her hand. "Whatever happens, you don't owe him anything," she said firmly, "but I'll be here if you need me." Caitlin nodded, grateful for Daisy's unwavering support. As the break room door creaked open, signaling the end of her break, she stood and smoothed her apron. "Thanks, Daisy," she said, her voice softer now. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'd still be amazing," Daisy replied with a grin, "but I'm glad you have me anyway." As Caitlin stepped back into the restaurant, her resolve hardened. She would face Marcelino, but she wouldn't let him dictate the terms of her life again. Whatever his intentions, she would protect herself and her child above all else. Marcelino arrived at the small coffee shop a full 20 minutes early, his nerves getting the better of him. The air was filled with the rich scent of freshly brewed coffee, and the quiet hum of conversation surrounded him. He chose a table near the window, one that offered a clear view of the entrance. He fiddled with the edge of his cup, his thoughts racing. Would Caitlin even show up? And if she did, what would he say to convince her he wasn't the same man she'd walked away from? The bell above the door chimed, and Marcelino's heart skipped a beat. Caitlin stepped inside, her coat drawn tightly around her, shielding her from the chill of the evening. She scanned the room briefly before her eyes landed on him. Her expression was guarded, her steps measured as she approached. "Hi," Marcelino said, rising to greet her. Caitlin gave a small nod, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Marcelino?" she said simply, sliding into the seat across from him. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice tentative. "I wasn't sure if you would." "I almost didn't," Caitlin admitted, crossing her arms as she leaned back in the chair. "But I figured you'd just keep showing up at my work if I didn't." Marcelino winced at the bluntness of her words, but nodded. "Fair enough," he said, his tone soft. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, Caitlin. That's the last thing I want." Caitlin's brow arched slightly. "You say that now, but it hasn't stopped you from showing up uninvited." He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I know," he said, "and I'm sorry. I've been trying to figure out how to say what I need to say." "Well, here's your chance," Caitlin said, her tone flat. "Say it." Marcelino hesitated, searching for the right words. "I know I don't deserve your trust," he began, "and I know I've hurt you in ways that can't be undone. But when I saw you the other night, I realized how much I've ignored, how much I've failed." Caitlin's gaze didn't soften, but she didn't interrupt. Encouraged by her silence, Marcelino continued. "I know I can't go back and fix what I broke, but I want to be part of this child's life, Caitlin. If the baby is mine, I need to do right by both of you." Caitlin leaned forward slightly, her expression sharp. "And what does that even mean, Marcelino?" she asked. "You think you can just step in and make everything better? Do you have any idea what it's been like for me?" Marcelino swallowed hard, her words cutting deeper than he had anticipated. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table as he met her gaze directly. "No, I don't know what it's been like for you," he admitted. "But I want to. I want to understand what you've gone through, and I want to do whatever I can to help." Caitlin let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "Help?" she repeated, her tone laced with disbelief. "Where was that desire to help when I was trying to save our marriage? When I was begging you to see me, to see us, as more than just some background detail in your life?" Her voice wavered slightly, but she quickly steadied herself. "You made your choices, Marcelino. You prioritized your company, your ego, and your endless string of distractions over the one person who actually believed in you." Marcelino flinched, the truth of her words hitting him like a blow to the chest. "You're right," he said quietly. "I did. I was selfish, Caitlin. I was so consumed by my own ambition that I couldn't see what I was doing to you, to us, and by the time I realized, it was too late." Caitlin's jaw tightened, her fingers curling into fists on the table. "You're damn right it was too late," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you have any idea how it felt to give up everything for someone who didn't even respect you? To be left with nothing while you went on living your perfect, polished life?" "I'm not living a perfect life," Marcelino said, his voice breaking slightly. "I've been miserable, Caitlin. I thought I could bury the guilt, move on, but I can't. Every success feels hollow. Every achievement reminds me of what I lost, of what I threw away." Caitlin's eyes narrowed, her skepticism evident. "And now you think you can make amends by showing up and saying you're sorry? By suddenly deciding you care about a child you didn't even know existed?" Marcelino shook his head. "I don't think saying sorry is enough," he said firmly. "I know it's not, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I can't ignore this baby. If there's a chance to be part of their life, I have to try. Not for me, but for them." Caitlin studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she let out a slow breath, leaning back in her chair. "You don't get to just try, Marcelino," she said. "This isn't about proving something to yourself. It's about being consistent, about showing up even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable, because that's what being a parent is." "I understand," Marcelino said softly, "and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Caitlin's gaze softened ever so slightly, though the walls around her remained firmly in place. "We'll see," she said finally, "but don't think for a second that I'm going to make this easy for you." Marcelino nodded, a flicker of hope sparking in his chest. "I wouldn't expect anything less," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. As Caitlin stood to leave, she paused, her hand resting on the back of the chair. "If you really mean what you're saying," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "then prove it. Show me that you're not just here because of guilt." Marcelino watched as she walked out of the coffee shop, her figure disappearing into the cool night. He sat there for a long moment, her words echoing in his mind. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, a chance to start making things right. Marcelino sat in his car, the streetlights casting long shadows across the dashboard. Caitlin's parting words from the coffee shop played on a loop in his mind. Prove it. They were simple, but carried a weight that felt almost unbearable. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. For the first time in years, he wasn't focused on sealing a deal or crafting the perfect pitch. This was something far more personal, and he wasn't sure how to start. The next morning, Marcelino was at his office, but his usual confidence was absent. The floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the Chicago skyline no longer felt like a view of triumph. Instead, they reminded him of how far he had distanced himself from real human connections. He stared at his laptop, a blank email draft open in front of him. It was meant for Atticus, but the words felt clunky and forced. "Marcelino," Atticus said, stepping into the office without knocking, as was his habit. "You called?" Marcelino closed the laptop, grateful for the distraction. "Yeah, I need your help," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I need to prove to Caitlin that I'm serious about being part of this baby's life." Atticus raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "And what exactly does prove it mean to her? Have you asked?" Marcelino shook his head. "She's not going to make it easy for me. She doesn't trust me. And honestly, she has every reason not to. But I can't sit back and hope things work out. I need to take action." Atticus studied him for a moment before sighing. "You know this isn't about grand gestures, right? Caitlin doesn't seem like the type who'd be impressed by flowers or fancy gifts. If you want her to believe you're serious, you need to start small. Show up in ways that matter to her." Marcelino frowned, his fingers drumming against the desk. "Like what?" Atticus smirked faintly. "That's for you to figure out. You know her better than I do. But if I were you, I'd focus on consistency. You've got a reputation for swooping in and then disappearing when things get inconvenient. This time, don't swoop. Just be there." Later that day, Marcelino found himself parked outside Caitlin's apartment. He hadn't told her he was coming. He didn't want to risk her telling him to leave, but he wasn't there to intrude. He had spent the morning gathering groceries, baby supplies, and a few practical items he thought she might need. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He left the bags on her doorstep, carefully arranging them so they wouldn't tip over. A small note sat on top, written in his careful, deliberate handwriting. Caitlin, I know I can't undo the past, but I hope this helps in some small way. Please let me know if there's anything else you need. Marcelino Caitlin stared at the bags on her doorstep, her hands resting on her hips as a mixture of emotions churned within her. She didn't have to look at the note to know who they were from. Marcelino's name was practically written in the neat arrangement of the groceries and supplies. Her first instinct was to push the bags aside, to ignore them as a futile attempt to win her over. But something stopped her. She picked up the note, her eyes scanning the brief message. It wasn't overly sentimental or manipulative, and that alone surprised her. Instead of grand promises, it felt like a genuine gesture. Her fingers tightened around the paper as she carried the bags inside, setting them on the counter. Daisy, who had stopped by to drop off some documents for work, peeked into the kitchen. "What's all this?" she asked, eyeing the supplies. "Caitlin," Daisy said, stepping closer, "you're allowed to accept help if you need it, especially with the baby coming. This doesn't mean you're forgiving him. It doesn't mean you're letting him back in." Caitlin sighed, rubbing her temples. "I know," she said, her voice softening. "It's just complicated. I don't want to rely on him, Daisy. I've worked so hard to build a life without him." "And you're doing amazing," Daisy said, placing a hand on Caitlin's arm. "But letting someone help doesn't erase that. It doesn't make you weak." Caitlin nodded reluctantly, her resolve softening. "I'll think about it." The next evening, Caitlin sent Marcelino a text, a simple thank you. She didn't elaborate, but it was enough to let him know she had received the supplies. Marcelino stared at the message when it popped up on his phone, a small flicker of relief washing over him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, Marcelino found small, quiet ways to show up. He didn't press Caitlin for conversations or try to impose himself in her life. Instead, he focused on being consistent. He arranged for repairs on her car after noticing the worn tires and left a voucher for a service check in her mailbox. When he learned from Atticus that her apartment complex was hosting a community baby shower, he donated anonymously, ensuring Caitlin wouldn't feel obligated. At first, Caitlin resisted. Each gesture felt like another thread pulling her back into a part of her life she had fought to leave behind. But as time went on, she began to notice the sincerity behind Marcelino's actions. There was no trace of the man who had once taken her for granted, only someone who seemed genuinely determined to be better. One evening, as Caitlin sat on the couch sorting through baby clothes she had received from the shower, she felt a wave of unexpected gratitude. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step. She picked up her phone, hesitating for a moment before typing a message. "We need to talk." Marcelino sat nervously in the waiting room of the prenatal clinic, his fingers drumming against his knee. The pastel walls and soft lighting did little to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside him. He glanced at the rows of chairs around him, where expectant mothers and their partners sat chatting quietly. The scene was both comforting and alien to him. This was a world he had never imagined being part of. The door to the exam rooms opened, and Caitlin stepped out, her expression unreadable. She hesitated when she saw him, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. Marcelino stood, his hands slipping into his pockets as he tried to gauge her mood. "You're early," Caitlin said, her tone neutral. "I didn't want to risk being late," Marcelino replied. "I didn't want to give you a reason to think I wasn't serious." Caitlin studied him for a moment, before nodding toward the reception desk. "We're up next," she said. "Come on." The walk to the exam room was quiet, the only sound the soft rustle of Caitlin's coat and the distant hum of conversation from the waiting area. Marcelino wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew this moment was important. It wasn't just about showing up, it was about proving he was willing to stand by her, no matter how uncomfortable or unfamiliar the situation might be. Inside the room, the nurse greeted them warmly, her cheerful demeanor putting Marcelino slightly at ease. She asked Caitlin a series of routine questions, her pen gliding across the chart as Caitlin answered. Marcelino stayed silent, unsure of his place in the conversation, but grateful to be included. When the nurse stepped out to prepare the ultrasound machine, Caitlin turned to Marcelino, her arms crossed. "You don't have to stay for this," she said. "If it's too much, I'll understand." Marcelino shook his head. "I want to be here," he said firmly, "if you'll let me." Caitlin's eyes searched his face for a moment before she sighed. "Okay," she said, her voice softer now. "But this doesn't mean everything's fine between us. I'm letting you in because of the baby, not because I've forgotten everything that happened." "I know," Marcelino said, "and I'm not expecting you to forget. I'm just grateful you're giving me this chance." Before Caitlin could respond, the nurse returned with the doctor, wheeling the ultrasound machine behind her. The room grew quieter as the exam began, the rhythmic beeping of the monitor filling the air. Marcelino sat beside Caitlin, his hands gripping the edge of his chair as the screen flickered to life. "There's your baby," the doctor said, pointing to the small moving image on the screen. Marcelino's breath caught, his chest tightening with emotion. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the image, unable to look away. Caitlin's eyes were also fixed on the screen, her expression softening as the faint image of her baby came into view. The rhythmic thumping of the heartbeat filled the room, steady and strong. For a moment, the tension between her and Marcelino seemed to dissolve, replaced by a shared awe. Marcelino swallowed hard, his throat tight as he watched the small, fluttering movement on the screen. "That's incredible," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned to Caitlin, his eyes glistening. "That's our baby?" The word "our" hung in the air, heavier than either of them expected. Caitlin glanced at him, her walls momentarily lowered. "Yes," she said quietly, "that's the baby." The doctor and nurse continued the exam, pointing out features and measurements, but Marcelino barely registered their words. His mind was consumed by the tiny life on the screen, the undeniable proof of something far bigger than himself. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to success or status. It was tied to something deeper, more profound. When the exam was over and the doctor handed Caitlin a few printed ultrasound images, Marcelino hesitated before speaking. Could I have one?" he asked, his voice tentative. Caitlin looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, to his surprise, she handed him one of the images. "Here," she said simply. Marcelino took it as though it were the most fragile thing in the world. He stared at the picture, a small lopsided smile forming on his face. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. As they left the clinic, the cool air hit them, and the weight of reality settled back over both of them. Caitlin tucked the remaining images into her bag and turned to Marcelino, her tone more guarded now. "This doesn't change anything between us," she said. "I'm letting you be involved because it's what's best for the baby. But that's it." Marcelino nodded, slipping the ultrasound image carefully into his wallet. "I understand," he said. "And I'll keep proving myself. Not just for the baby, but because I owe you that much." Caitlin didn't respond right away. Instead, she started walking toward the bus stop, her thoughts racing. Despite her efforts to keep her distance, something about the way Marcelino had looked at the ultrasound stayed with her. There was a sincerity she hadn't seen in years, a flicker of the man she had once believed in. Marcelino watched her go, resisting the urge to offer her a ride. He knew this wasn't the time to push. Instead, he stood on the sidewalk, the ultrasound image still in his mind, and made a silent vow to himself. He wouldn't let her, or the baby, down again. Caitlin sat on the edge of her bed, her hands resting protectively on her growing belly. The room was dimly lit, the soft hum of the radiator filling the silence. She had been feeling off all day, a dull ache in her back, coupled with an unusual fatigue that left her more drained than usual. Daisy had insisted she call her doctor, but Caitlin had waved off the concern, chalking it up to the stress of working long hours and carrying the weight of everything on her shoulders. Still, a nagging worry lingered in the back of her mind. She glanced at her phone, debating whether to reach out to the clinic. Before she could decide, a sharp cramp rippled through her abdomen, stealing her breath. Her hand flew to her stomach as panic set in. This wasn't normal. Grabbing her phone, Caitlin scrolled to the number for her doctor but hesitated. She didn't want to overreact, but the pain was growing worse. Just as she was about to press call, another wave hit her, stronger this time. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the button, her heart pounding in her chest. The receptionist's calm voice answered, asking a few questions before quickly transferring her to the on-call nurse. Caitlin tried to keep her voice steady as she explained the symptoms, but the concern in the nurse's tone only made her anxiety spike. The nurse advised her to come in immediately to be evaluated. Caitlin grabbed her coat, her mind racing. She hated feeling vulnerable, hated asking for help, but she wasn't about to risk her baby's health. As she stepped outside into the chilly evening air, she dialed Daisy's number, praying her friend could give her a ride. The call went to voicemail. "Damn it!" Caitlin muttered, wrapping her coat tighter around her. She had no choice but to figure it out herself. She was about to order a rideshare when her phone buzzed with an incoming text. It was from Marcelino. "Just checking in. How are you feeling today?" She stared at the message for a moment, her pride battling with her fear. But another cramp stole her breath, and the decision was made for her. She quickly typed back, "Not great. I think I need to go to the clinic. Can you drive me?" The reply came almost instantly. "I'm on my way." Within minutes, Marcelino pulled up in front of her building. He jumped out of the car, his expression laced with concern. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "Something's wrong," Caitlin said, her voice shaking. "The nurse told me to come in right away." Marcelino nodded, opening the passenger door for her. "Let's go," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. As they drove, Marcelino kept glancing at her, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "You'll be okay," he said, more to himself than to her. "We'll get you there, and everything will be fine." Caitlin didn't respond, her focus on the rhythmic breathing she'd learned from her prenatal classes. She didn't trust herself to speak without breaking down. The hospital lobby was bustling when they arrived, but Marcelino didn't hesitate. He parked the car haphazardly near the entrance, ignoring the protests of the valet staff, and rushed to Caitlin's side. His hand hovered over her arm, unsure if she would accept the gesture, but Caitlin surprised him by leaning on him slightly as they walked inside. A nurse quickly escorted them to an exam room, her reassuring demeanor doing little to calm Caitlin's nerves. Marcelino stayed close, watching silently, as the nurse took Caitlin's vitals and asked her a series of questions. The nurse's face remained neutral, but Marcelino noticed the quick, efficient movements as she left the room to fetch the doctor. Caitlin sat on the exam table, her hands gripping the edges as if bracing herself. "I don't like this," she admitted quietly. "I hate not knowing what's going on." Marcelino pulled a chair closer, lowering himself so he was at her eye level. "Whatever happens, you're not alone," he said firmly. "We'll figure this out together." Before Caitlin could respond, the door opened and the doctor stepped in, her expression calm but professional. "Ms. Harper," she said, glancing at the chart in her hands. "It sounds like you've been having some concerning symptoms. Let's take a look and see what's going on." The next few minutes were tense as the doctor performed an ultrasound, the room eerily silent except for the steady hum of the machine. Marcelino held his breath, his eyes fixed on the screen. When the rhythmic sound of the baby's heartbeat filled the room, both he and Caitlin exhaled simultaneously. "That's a good sign," the doctor said, her voice soothing. "The baby's heartbeat is strong, but it looks like you're experiencing some preterm contractions. It's not unusual at this stage, but we'll want to monitor you closely to make sure it doesn't progress." Caitlin's hands tightened on the edge of the table. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice wavering. "It means you'll need to take it easy," the doctor replied. "No strenuous activity, no heavy lifting, and I'd recommend cutting back on work if possible. Stress can exacerbate these symptoms, and we want to avoid anything that could put you or the baby at risk." Caitlin nodded, but Marcelino could see the tension in her posture. She wasn't used to leaning on others, and the idea of slowing down clearly didn't sit well with her. "I'll make sure she rests," Marcelino said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Whatever she needs, I'll take care of it." The doctor glanced between them, her expression neutral. "Good. Support is important right now. I'll prescribe some medication to help ease the contractions, but you'll need to come back for regular checkups." As they left the hospital, the weight of the evening settled over both of them. Marcelino helped Caitlin into the car, his movements careful and deliberate. Once they were on the road, he glanced at her, his voice soft but determined. "You don't have to do this alone, Caitlin. I meant what I said. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Caitlin didn't respond immediately. She stared out the window, her fingers resting lightly on her stomach. "We'll see," she said finally, her tone more tired than defiant. "We'll see." Marcelino stood outside Caitlin's apartment building, balancing a grocery bag in one hand and a bouquet of fresh lavender in the other. The sharp November air bit at his face, but he barely noticed. Over the past few weeks, his visits had become a regular occurrence. Not that Caitlin had ever explicitly invited him. Still, she hadn't turned him away either, and that small allowance was enough to keep him coming back. When Caitlin opened the door, she looked tired but healthier than the last time he had seen her. The enforced rest and fewer hours at work seemed to be helping, though Marcelino could tell the idea of relying on others still grated on her. Her eyes flicked to the items in his hands, and she crossed her arms. "What's all this?" she asked, her tone wary but not unkind. "Groceries," Marcelino said simply, lifting the bag slightly. "And this," he held up the lavender, "is for your nightstand. The doctor mentioned relaxation, and I read somewhere that lavender helps with stress." Caitlin blinked, caught off guard. "You've been researching ways to help me relax?" Marcelino shrugged, feeling uncharacteristically self-conscious. "I figured it couldn't hurt." She stared at him for a moment before stepping aside, gesturing for him to come in. "Fine," she said, her tone resigned. "But don't think this means I've changed my mind about anything." "I wouldn't dream of it," Marcelino replied, walking into the small apartment. The space was modest but cozy, with signs of Caitlin's meticulous care in every corner. He set the groceries on the counter, glancing at the baby gear that now occupied much of the living room, a crib against the wall, a pile of baby clothes neatly folded on the couch. "You've been busy," Marcelino said, nodding toward the items. Caitlin followed his gaze, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Daisy's been helping me get organized," she admitted. "She's a force of nature when it comes to this stuff." Marcelino chuckled, unpacking the groceries. "She seems like a good friend." "She is," Caitlin said, sitting down at the kitchen table. She's been my rock through all of this." Marcelino hesitated, then turned to face her, his expression serious. "I want to be that for you too, Caitlin. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm trying to show you that I'm not the man I used to be." Caitlin looked away, her fingers tracing patterns on the table. "You're different," she admitted softly. "But it's hard to forget everything that happened. The things you said, the way you made me feel like I didn't matter." Marcelino's chest tightened, the weight of her words hitting him hard. He sat down across from her, his voice low. "I can't change what I did, Caitlin, but I can spend the rest of my life making sure you and the baby know how much you matter now." Caitlin studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if searching for cracks in his sincerity. Marcelino didn't look away, his expression steady, almost vulnerable. After a long silence, she exhaled and leaned back in her chair. "It's not just about me," she said finally, her voice softer now. "I need to know that if I let you into this baby's life, you'll be consistent, that you won't disappear the moment things get hard." Marcelino nodded, his throat tight. "I understand," he said. "And you're right to ask that. I've spent most of my life avoiding responsibility, Caitlin, but this baby isn't something I'll ever walk away from. I'll prove it to you every day, if that's what it takes." Caitlin didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stood and walked toward the crib in the corner, running her fingers lightly over its wooden edge. "It's just so hard to trust that," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You left me once, Marcelino. You left me to pick up the pieces alone. How do I know you won't do it again?" Marcelino rose and crossed the room, stopping a few feet from her. "You don't," he said simply. "I can't erase the past, Caitlin. But I can promise you that I'll never stop trying to make things right, for you and for this baby." Caitlin turned to face him, her arms wrapped around herself. "You're asking me to take a huge risk," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Not just for me, but for our child. And if you fail—" "I won't," Marcelino said firmly. "I won't let you down again, and if I do, you can shut me out for good. But I'm asking you for this chance, Caitlin. Not for me, but for the family we can still be." The word family hung in the air, and for a moment Caitlin seemed frozen, caught between hope and fear. Slowly, she nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I don't know if I can believe that yet," she said, "but I'll give you the chance to prove me wrong." Marcelino felt a wave of relief, though he knew this was just the beginning. "Thank you," he said earnestly. "I won't waste it." The tension in the room eased slightly as Caitlin wiped her cheek and gave him a faint smile. "You can start by helping me sort through these baby clothes," she said, gesturing toward the pile on the couch. Marcelino chuckled softly, the sound tinged with genuine warmth. "That," he said, rolling up his sleeves, "I can do." As they worked side by side, folding tiny onesies and organizing diapers, a tentative sense of partnership began to form. It was fragile, like a sapling just breaking through the soil, but it was there. And for the first time in years, both Marcelino and Caitlin felt the faint stirrings of something they thought they'd lost: hope. The evening sun cast long shadows across the walls of Caitlin's apartment, bathing the space in a soft orange glow. Marcelino sat at the dining table, carefully assembling a baby swing he had picked up earlier that day. His brow furrowed in concentration as he sorted through the pieces, consulting the instruction manual every few minutes. Caitlin watched from the couch, a faint smile on her face as she sipped a cup of herbal tea. "You're taking this way too seriously," she teased, her tone light but affectionate. Marcelino glanced up, smirking. "If I don't, this thing might collapse the first time we use it," he replied, holding up a small bolt. "Do you want our kid to inherit my engineering skills?" Caitlin chuckled, shaking her head. "I'll admit I wasn't expecting you to be so meticulous. "I'm full of surprises," he said, focusing back on his work. For a moment, there was a comfortable silence between them, a rare and fragile truce. Marcelino couldn't remember the last time he had felt so at ease, so grounded. The baby wasn't even born yet, but already he could feel the pull of something greater than himself. It terrified him and exhilarated him in equal measure. Caitlin shifted on the couch, setting her mug on the coffee table. "You know," she said softly, "I didn't think you'd stick around this long." Marcelino paused, his hands hovering over the half-assembled swing. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice steady. "I meant what I said, Caitlin. I'm in this for the long haul." She nodded but didn't reply. Instead, she rested her hand on her belly, her fingers tracing small, absent-minded circles. Marcelino watched her for a moment before returning to his work, determined to prove his words through action. Suddenly, Caitlin gasped, her body tensing. Marcelino's head snapped up, alarm flashing across his face. "What's wrong?" he asked, moving to her side in an instant. Caitlin's hand gripped the edge of the couch as she leaned forward, her breaths shallow and rapid. It's happening again," she said, her voice strained. "Your contractions?" Marcelino asked, his heart pounding. "How bad are they?" "Worse than before," she admitted, wincing as another wave of pain hit her. "We need to go." Marcelino didn't hesitate. He grabbed her coat and helped her to her feet, his movements quick but gentle. "Lean on me," he said, wrapping an arm around her waist as they made their way to the door. The drive to the hospital was tense, the silence punctuated only by Caitlin's labored breathing and Marcelino's murmured reassurances. He kept one hand on the steering wheel, the other hovering near her arm, as if ready to catch her should she falter. When they arrived, the ER staff moved quickly, ushering Caitlin into a wheelchair and rolling her into the maternity ward. Marcelino followed close behind, his jaw clenched as he tried to suppress the growing panic in his chest. He hated feeling helpless, but there was nothing he could do now except be there for her. A nurse directed him to a waiting area outside the exam room, and Marcelino sat down, his head in his hands. Time stretched painfully as he waited, each minute dragging like an eternity. Finally, the door opened, and a doctor emerged, her expression calm but serious. "She's stable for now," the doctor said, addressing Marcelino, "but the contractions are a concern. We're monitoring her closely, and she's been given medication to try and stop the labor." Marcelino nodded, relief and worry warring within him. "Can I see her?" he asked. The doctor smiled faintly. "Of course, but keep things calm. She's under a lot of stress." When Marcelino entered the room, he found Caitlin lying on the hospital bed, her face pale but her eyes clear. She offered him a weak smile as he approached, pulling a chair to her bedside. "You're okay," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "The baby's okay." Caitlin nodded, her hand resting over her belly. "They said it's too early," she murmured. "I have to stay here until things settle down." Marcelino reached out, hesitating for a moment before taking her hand in his. "Then I'll stay too," he said, "for as long as you need." Caitlin looked at him, her defenses momentarily lowered. "I didn't think I'd need this much help," she admitted. "I've always handled things on my own." "You don't have to anymore," Marcelino said firmly. "You've carried enough on your own, Caitlin. Let me carry some of it now." As the evening wore on, Marcelino remained by Caitlin's side, his resolve unwavering. The room had settled into a calm silence after Daisy left to grab a coffee, leaving the two of them alone. Caitlin, her exhaustion evident, shifted slightly in the bed. Marcelino noticed and immediately leaned forward. "Do you need anything? Water? Another blanket?" he asked, his voice low. Caitlin shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips despite the circumstances. You don't have to hover, Marcelino. I'm okay. Just tired. He nodded, leaning back but not relaxing entirely. The events of the day had shaken him deeply, and the image of her being rushed into the hospital was something he couldn't quite shake. It was a stark reminder of how fragile life could be and how much he stood to lose if he didn't do everything in his power to support her. After a moment, Caitlin spoke, her voice softer. You know, you're surprising me. Marcelino looked at her, his brow furrowing. How so? You're here, she said, her gaze meeting his. Not just physically, but really here. The Marcelino I used to know would have sent flowers or a fancy gift and called it a day. But you're different. Marcelino swallowed hard, her words stirring something deep within him. I don't want to be the man I was before, Caitlin, he said quietly. I spent too long prioritizing the wrong things, too long letting my own ego blind me to what really matters. This, he gestured to her and the small swell of her belly. This is what matters. You, the baby. I can't undo what I did before, but I can promise you I'm here now, for as long as you'll let me be. Caitlin didn't respond immediately, her expression thoughtful as she searched his face. Finally, she let out a small sigh. I want to believe you, she admitted. But it's hard. It's going to take time. I understand, Marcelino said, his voice steady. Take all the time you need. I'll be here. Their conversation was interrupted by the return of the nurse, who entered with a clipboard in hand. Good news, she said with a warm smile. The contractions have stopped, and your vitals look stable. We'll keep you overnight for observation, but if everything continues as it is, you should be able to go home tomorrow. Caitlin let out a breath of relief, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Thank you, she said, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. Marcelino echoed her thanks, his chest lightening at the news. As the nurse left, he turned back to Caitlin. That's good news, he said, his relief evident. It is, Caitlin agreed, though her expression remained contemplative. But it's a wake-up call too. I need to take better care of myself, for the baby. Marcelino nodded, leaning forward again. And you don't have to do it alone. I meant what I said, Caitlin. I'll be here for whatever you need. For the first time, Caitlin didn't argue. She gave him a small nod, her walls lowering just a little more. Okay, she said softly. We'll see. Marcelino smiled faintly, the flicker of hope in her words giving him strength. As Caitlin drifted into a light sleep, he stayed by her side, the weight of responsibility settling over him in a way that felt right. This wasn't just about redemption anymore. It was about building something new, something better, for all of them. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Caitlin's apartment as she sat at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of herbal tea. Across from her, Marcelino unpacked a bag of fresh produce, his movements careful and deliberate. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the hospital scare, and while Caitlin still struggled to fully relax, there was a noticeable difference in her demeanor. The enforced rest had given her time to reflect, and Marcelino's unwavering presence was starting to chip away at her doubts. You don't have to do this every morning, you know, Caitlin said, watching as Marcelino placed a carton of eggs in the fridge. I can handle breakfast on my own. I know, Marcelino replied without looking up. But I don't mind. Besides, it's good practice. Pretty soon we'll both be making breakfast for someone else. Caitlin's lips twitched into a reluctant smile. You're assuming I'll let you anywhere near the kitchen once the baby comes? Marcelino chuckled softly, closing the fridge and turning to face her. Fair point. But until then, you're stuck with me. Caitlin shook her head, but there was no real irritation in her expression. Instead, She found herself appreciating the way Marcelino had stepped up, not with grand gestures, but with quiet, consistent actions that showed he was paying attention. Whether it was restocking her groceries, organizing the baby supplies, or simply being there when she needed a ride to her appointments, he had made himself an undeniable part of her daily life. "I talked to Daisy yesterday," Caitlin said after a moment, setting her mug down. "She said the crib still needs to be assembled." Marcelino raised an eyebrow. "Consider it done. I'll take care of it this afternoon." "Don't say that if you don't mean it," Caitlin warned, though her tone was teasing. "Daisy's been threatening to put it together herself if I don't stop procrastinating." Marcelino laughed. "Tell Daisy she can relax. I'll have it done before dinner." As promised, Marcelino spent the afternoon in Caitlin's living room, surrounded by an intimidating array of screws, wooden panels, and an instruction manual that seemed unnecessarily complicated. Despite the challenge, he approached the task with patience, methodically piecing the crib together while Caitlin supervised from the couch. "You're surprisingly good at this," Caitlin remarked, her tone laced with amusement. "I half expected you to give up and call a handyman." Marcelino smirked, tightening a screw with deliberate precision. "I've built my share of things," he said. "Granted, they were mostly business ventures, not furniture, but I like to think the skills are transferable." Caitlin rolled her eyes but didn't hide her smile. "Well, as long as the crib doesn't collapse the first time we put the baby in it, I'll consider it a success." By the time the crib was finished, Caitlin was sitting cross-legged on the couch, sorting through a stack of tiny baby clothes. She glanced up as Marcelino stepped back to admire his handiwork, a rare look of pride on his face. "Not bad," she admitted. "I think you might have found your new calling." Marcelino laughed, wiping his hands on his jeans. "If this whole CEO thing doesn't work out, maybe I'll start a crib assembly business." Caitlin shook her head, her smile lingering as she folded another onesie. "Thanks," she said softly. "For this. For everything." Marcelino's expression softened. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I'm just glad I can help." The moment was quiet, but significant, a small step toward the trust they were both working to rebuild. Marcelino knew there was still a long way to go, but he could see the beginnings of something fragile but real, a partnership they might one day fully reclaim. As the evening settled in, Caitlin moved to the kitchen to prepare a simple dinner. Marcelino offered to help, but she waved him off, claiming she needed to stretch her legs. From the living room, he watched her move carefully, her steps slow and deliberate as she pulled ingredients from the fridge. The rhythmic clatter of pots and pans filled the apartment, a comforting reminder of normalcy. "You're going to make me useless if you keep doing all this," Marcelino called out, leaning back on the couch. Caitlin peeked over her shoulder, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Trust me, you've been plenty useful. I just need to feel like I'm contributing something. Sitting around all day is starting to make me stir crazy." "Well, you're not on bed rest anymore," Marcelino pointed out. "But don't push yourself too hard, okay? Doctor's orders." "Yes, Dad," Caitlin quipped, her tone teasing, but her smile faltered slightly as the word hung between them. Marcelino noticed, his expression softening. "Do you think about it much?" he asked gently. "What it's going to be like, being a parent." Caitlin paused, her hands stilling over the cutting board. "Every day," she admitted. "And if I'm being honest, it terrifies me. There's so much I don't know, so much that could go wrong." Marcelino nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I feel the same way. I keep wondering if I'll be good enough, if I'll know what to do when the time comes." Caitlin turned to face him, leaning against the counter. "You never really struck me as the unsure type," she said softly. Marcelino chuckled, though the sound was tinged with self-deprecation. "I've been good at pretending, I guess, but this is different. It's not just about me anymore. It's about the baby, about you, about doing everything I can to make sure neither of you ever feels like you're not enough." Caitlin studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded, returning to her task. "That's a good start," she said, her voice steady. "But talk is easy. Action is harder." "I know," Marcelino replied, "and I'm ready for that." Dinner was quiet but comfortable, the conversation light as they shared stories from their past. Marcelino told Caitlin about his early struggles building his business, the risks he took, and the lessons he learned along the way. Caitlin, in turn, shared memories of her childhood, her dreams of a career in marketing, and the small victories that had kept her going through tough times. After they finished eating, Marcelino insisted on cleaning up, leaving Caitlin to relax on the couch. As he washed the dishes, he couldn't help but glance over at her every so often, her figure bathed in the warm glow of the table lamp. She looked peaceful, almost content, as she flipped through a parenting book Daisy had lent her. Once the kitchen was spotless, Marcelino joined her, settling into the armchair across from the couch. Caitlin glanced up from her book, her brow furrowing slightly. "What's on your mind?" she asked. Marcelino hesitated before speaking. "I was just thinking about how far we've come," he said. "A few months ago, I didn't think I'd even see you again. And now, I don't know. It feels like we're starting to find our way back to something." Caitlin closed the book, setting it aside. "It's a long way back," she said, her tone cautious. "But you're right. It does feel different." Marcelino nodded, his gaze steady. "Different can be good," he said, "and I'm willing to take things one step at a time, as long as it means I can be here for you and the baby." Caitlin's lips curved into a faint smile. "One step at a time," she echoed. "I think I can work with that." The moment stretched between them, quiet but charged with unspoken meaning. It wasn't a resolution, but it was progress, a tentative step toward rebuilding the trust and connection they had once shared. As the night deepened, Marcelino left, promising to return the next day to help with more baby preparations. Caitlin watched him go, her heart a mix of hope and caution. For the first time in a long time, she felt the faint stirrings of something she thought she had lost, the possibility of a future where they could truly be a family. The room was alive with motion and sound, the sharp beep of monitors, the hurried steps of nurses, and the low, steady voice of the doctor giving instructions. Marcelino stood near the corner, his hands clenched into fists at his sides as he watched Caitlin, her face pale and strained, lying on the hospital bed. She was deep into labor, her breaths coming in shallow gasps as the nurse adjusted her position. "You're doing great, Caitlin," the doctor said, her tone calm but firm. "Just a little longer. The baby's doing fine." Marcelino stepped closer, his heart pounding in sync with the rhythmic beep of the fetal monitor. Caitlin turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. Despite the exhaustion and pain etched across her features, there was a flicker of determination in her gaze that both awed and humbled him. "You've got this," Marcelino said, his voice soft but steady. He reached for her hand, and to his surprise, she took it, her grip tight and unyielding. "I swear," Caitlin said through gritted teeth, her voice laced with both humor and frustration, "if you tell me to breathe one more time, I'm throwing you out." Marcelino let out a nervous chuckle, the tension in the room easing just slightly. "Noted," he said. "No breathing advice." The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Marcelino stayed at her side, holding her hand through each contraction, whispering words of encouragement even when he wasn't sure she could hear him. He marveled at her strength, at the sheer willpower it took for her to bring their child into the world. Finally, the doctor's voice broke through the chaos. "Here we go, Caitlin. One more push." Caitlin's entire body seemed to tense as she gave one last monumental effort. Marcelino held his breath, his heart hammering in his chest. And then, suddenly the room was filled with a sound that made every nerve in his body sing. A baby's cry, loud and piercing, cutting through the air like a bell. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, lifting the tiny, wriggling infant for Caitlin to see. The nurses worked quickly, cleaning and wrapping the baby before placing him gently in Caitlin's arms. Caitlin's face crumpled as she looked down at the baby, her tears spilling freely. Marcelino leaned closer, his own eyes wet with unshed tears as he gazed at the small, perfect life cradled in her arms. The baby's tiny fists waved in the air, his cries softening as he nestled against Caitlin's chest. "He's beautiful," Marcelino whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like his mom." Caitlin let out a shaky laugh, her eyes never leaving the baby. "He's perfect," she said, her voice barely audible. "We did this. We brought him here." Marcelino nodded, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the blanket swaddling their son. For a moment, the world outside the room ceased to exist, and all that mattered was the small, fragile life between them. The hours following the birth passed in a blur of quiet moments and gentle care. Caitlin rested in the hospital bed, her exhaustion tempered by the overwhelming love she felt for the tiny baby sleeping peacefully in her arms. Marcelino sat beside her, his eyes never leaving the child. Every so often, he would reach out, brushing a feather-light touch across the baby's cheek, marveling at the softness of his skin. "He looks like you," Marcelino said softly, his voice tinged with wonder. Caitlin glanced down at the baby, her lips curving into a tired smile. "Maybe," she said, "but he's got your serious expression, like he's already plotting his first big move." Marcelino chuckled quietly, the sound warm and unguarded. "If he's half as determined as you, he'll take over the world by the time he's 5. Caitlin shook her head, her smile growing wider. "Let's start with crawling and see how it goes." The easy banter between them felt natural, as if the weight of the past had momentarily lifted in the presence of something new and pure. Marcelino leaned back in his chair, a rare sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. As evening fell, Daisy arrived, her face lighting up when she saw the baby. "Oh my goodness," she said, rushing to the bedside. "He's perfect, Caitlin. Absolutely perfect." Caitlin beamed, handing the baby to Daisy with care. "Meet your honorary aunt," she said, her voice filled with affection. Daisy cooed over the baby, her enthusiasm infectious. "Look at these little fingers, and his nose. Caitlin, he's going to be a heartbreaker." Marcelino stood nearby, watching the scene with quiet gratitude. Daisy caught his eye and offered him a warm smile. "Looks like you did good, Dad," she said. He blinked, the word Dad settling over him like a revelation. It wasn't just a title. It was a responsibility, a privilege, and a promise. Marcelino nodded, his voice steady. "We both did," he said, his gaze shifting back to Caitlin. Later that night, as the hospital quieted and visitors left, Marcelino remained by Caitlin's side. The baby was swaddled in the bassinet nearby, his tiny breaths the only sound in the room. Marcelino reached for Caitlin's hand, his touch tentative but sincere. "I know I've said it before," he began, his voice low, "but I need to say it again. Thank you for letting me be here, for letting me share this with you." Caitlin looked at him, her eyes soft but serious. "I didn't do it for you, Marcelino," she said. "I did it for him." Marcelino nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "I know, and that's why I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving to both of you that I deserve to be here." Caitlin studied him for a long moment before her expression softened. "You're off to a good start," she said quietly, "but you still have a lot to prove." "And I will," Marcelino promised, his voice filled with conviction. Every day. As Caitlin drifted off to sleep, Marcelino stayed awake, his eyes on the baby. He thought of the mistakes he'd made, the bridges he'd burned, and the second chance he'd been given. This wasn't just redemption. It was a new beginning, a chance to build something meaningful and lasting. In that moment, he made a silent vow. He would be the father his son deserved, the partner Caitlin needed, and the man he had once promised himself he would become. And for the first time in his life, he knew he wouldn't let them down. The next morning, as the sunlight streamed through the window, the three of them, Caitlin, Marcelino, and their baby, shared their first quiet moments as a family. It wasn't perfect, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but it was theirs. And that, they both realized, was more than enough.